Given a graph, we need to be able to write the equation using either a sine or a cosine. So let's do one of them. They'll do this one in the form y equal a sine omega x plus phi plus b, and then we'll do one with a cosine, then we'll do one where we can kind of choose one or the other. We need to be able to use either function. All right, so the first thing we want to do is figure out where the baseline is. So I'm going to make a line that goes through the middle of the graph that it oscillates about. We see that it's 4 above or 4 below the baseline. So we know the amplitude is 4, and we know that there is nothing added on the end because it's right along the x-axis. All right, the next thing we want to do is figure out the period. So at 0, it's at an intercept. It goes down, up, comes back at pi. So the period equals pi. So that means 2 pi over omega needs to equal pi. So we can see omega needs to equal 2, so the 2's would cancel and we would have a pi there. So we're going to have 2x. And as we look for a phase shift, the sine of 0 is 0, so we don't need a phase shift. But the one thing we do need, because normally then sine goes to its maximum and instead it's going to its minimum, so it's reflected about the x. So we need to put a negative in front of that so it'll make it reflected about the x. So there's the equation that we see graphed. Now let's look at another one, and let's have this one end up in the form y equal a cosine omega x plus phi plus b. So the first thing we want to do again is figure out the baseline, and we can see that it's oscillating at about a line right here that's at y equal -1. It goes as high as 3 and down 3 from that baseline. So we now know the amplitude is 3, and we know the b, the vertical shift, is -1. Now let's go ahead and see if we can figure out the period. It looks like at the baseline here, if we did one complete cycle, we'd be over here at 4. So the period is 4, and that's not got a pi in it. The period is just 4, integer number 4. So we know that 2 pi over omega needs to equal the period. So let's take this and solve it for omega. We're going to multiply both sides by omega and divide both sides by 4. So omega equals 2 pi fourths, which is pi halves. So let's write our equation, what we have so far. Y equals 3. Cosine our omega is pi over 2x. Now what about a phase shift? Well, this is a cosine graph. At 0, it's normally at its maximum, right up here, but we see the maximum is over here to the left by 1. So our phase shift needs to be -1. Well, our phase shift comes from taking that omega x plus phi equals 0 and solving it for x, which is negative phi over omega. And that needs to equal -1. Well, we know omega, so negative phi. Well, let's go ahead and multiply both sides by omega to get it over there. And then negative phi then would be negative omega, and omega was pi over 2, so phi must be pi over 2. So if we have plus pi over 2, and then we have our -1 on the end, when we set this equal to 0 and solve it, we get that -1 shifting it to the left 1, and that -1 on the end moves it up 1. So there's the equation of what we see graphed. Now we're going to look at one more, and as we look at this one, we are just going to decide which trig function to use based on which one we think might be easiest, because we could use either one. So if it doesn't tell you, you can choose which one. First thing I'm going to do is find the baseline. I'm drawing a line through the center of the graph. I go up as high as 3 above that line and down as low as 3 below that line. So that is moved up 2 at y equal 2. So we know there's going to be a plus 2 on the end, and we know 3 is going to be out in front. That's our amplitude. Let's go ahead and figure out our period. So here it's crossing the baseline, one complete cycle crossing the baseline right here. So that was at pi over 4 to 5 pi over 4. So the distance between there is pi. So our period is pi. So we know 2 pi over omega has to equal our period. So omega must be 2, so that will equal. So let's write down what we have. Well, let's decide which trig function. Are we going to use sine or cosine? Well, let's see what's going on at 0, and then we'll make a decision. So if we look here at 0, it looks like the function is at its minimum. So if I use a cosine graph, I won't have to worry about a phase shift, so that will be easier. But notice it's minimum, not maximum, so it's going to need a negative out in front to reflect it over the x-axis. So at 0, it'll be at its minimum. So it's going to be y equal a negative out in front. The amplitude is 3. We're doing a cosine. We found out that omega needed to be 2. So that's going to be 2x, and then everything was shifted up 2, so plus 2 on the end. We could have also used a sine function, but then it would have needed a phase shift, and it's easier to do without the phase shift. So if you can choose, you can pick the one that the graph more closely resembles. And we know that with a phase shift, they equal each other, so both of them would work.